Hello and welcome to your lecture on cities and technology. Grab your student notes and use it to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. The agricultural revolution happens across the world at various points in history. However, it had to happen somewhere first, and that place was the Middle East. Take a look at this map of the world and point to the Middle East. If you pointed to this area in here, nice work. Here's a close-up. And within the Middle East, take a look at modern-day Iraq. Mesopotamia, where human civilization began, was located in what is now modern-day Iraq. Mesopotamia itself means the land between rivers. It's a Greek word. The rivers in question are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and here you have Mesopotamia right between them. Mesopotamia is known as the cradle of civilization because it's here that we have the first traces of human civilization. A cradle is where you hold and rock a baby. Mesopotamia was where the world held and rocked the first civilization. However, civilization didn't spring up across all of Mesopotamia at once. Instead, it started in this area to the south called Sumer, right up against the Persian Gulf. The area is called Sumer. The people and language are called Sumerian. You might think that the location of the first civilization would be bursting with all sorts of awesome natural resources, but that's actually not the case. Sumer had rich soil, which is great for growing crops, but it didn't have much else. There was no timber, no metal, no good stone. The only way for people to survive in Sumer was to work together to irrigate their fields. Irrigation refers to ditches, canals, dams, nowadays sprinklers, that divert water onto crops. It's hard work digging ditches, especially with primitive tools. Remember, they didn't have metal at this point. They're still digging with stone or wood or mud brick. But if you don't bring water to the fields, you die. So people had to work together. And some people believe that it was this intense pressure to watch out for each other, to work together, to build a community that made Sumer the location of the first civilization. The first city in Sumer was named Eridu, and hundreds, even thousands of years after it had been founded, the Sumerians remembered that this is where their civilization had begun. After kingship was lowered down from heaven, they said, the kingship was in Eridu. Here's a picture of the location of Eridu. It doesn't look like much today, does it? As Mr. Krawczyk writes in his book Babylon, for all ancient Mesopotamians knew that civilization had begun at Eridu in the deep south on the shores of the Persian Gulf. It looks a very unlikely location for humanity to have taken such a momentous step. Dry, dusty, and deserted, the tan-colored mounds look as rumpled as a slept-in bed. Around them, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. There is nothing within sight that speaks of life, of humanity, of progress, of achievement. Even the river that once made Eridu habitable is now distant and out of sight. Time changes the land. It breaks down buildings, it fills in rivers. Eridu today does not look the same as Eridu did thousands of years ago. Thousands of years ago, Eridu was a small chapel. It began as a tiny chapel on the shores of the great sacred lake Apsu. Ancient cities in the beginning were often just chapels, little altars or little houses to worship, and people, as time went on, would move closer to these chapels to be able to worship, and then other people would move closer to them to sell them things or take on other jobs, and slowly but surely you'd have communities build up, and then they would make that chapel or that altar larger in order to service the needs of more people, and bigger, so that Eridu, which once started off as a small chapel, soon turned into a thriving metropolis with a beautiful and grand temple at its heart. This practice of a chapel drawing people and growing larger and then drawing more people and larger is not unique to Eridu. You can see it in the Bible as well. If you've ever wondered why in Genesis people keep going around and founding altars, and then later those altars are called cities, that's what's happening. So for example, in Genesis 28:18, it says, "Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz." So here you see Jacob putting down the foundation of his city. He takes the rock that he slept on, he pours oil on it, he makes it into a sacred space, and over time, it attracts more people. People start to set up shop, start to farm, start to take on other jobs until it turns into a city, the city that used to be called Luz. Eridu, which began as a small chapel, ended up, as I said, a thriving metropolis with an enormous temple. And when the Sumerians made that small chapel larger, they didn't just build it in a different place, they built it on top of the foundations of the old chapel. And because of this, the temple at Eridu actually has 16 layers. You can see it in here. So you have the original chapel down here, and then they build it larger and larger and larger. And so that by the time we reach the end of the heyday of Eridu, you have this enormous temple, so far from what this chapel used to be. And as I said, these are all built on top of one another. So in order to see the chapel, you actually have to excavate down through all of the other layers. In 1855, when Eridu was discovered, archaeologists did just that. So that here, right here, if you can believe it, is the original chapel at Eridu. This is the place where civilization began. Here you have an artist's depiction of Eridu in its heyday, the temple, the sacred lake Apsu, whence, according to the Sumerians, dry land and all life had arisen. You have a boat on that selfsame lake, the city rising in the background, its people crowding down the steps. Eridu was more than just a city, a group of people living together. It was also the center of technological innovation. There's a saying that necessity is the mother of invention. What that means is that people invent things in order to solve problems. You have to get water from the river to your fields. How do you do it? All right, you're going to invent irrigation. You're going to dig ditches to mimic the streams that you've seen and find ways to divert water to those fields. But how are you going to dig them? Now you need to develop tools in order to dig those ditches. Every single problem forces people to think of a solution, and that leads to new inventions. Sometimes those inventions are game-changing, like the wheel. Other times they are also game-changing, but perhaps in a different way, like the invention of beer. Yes, people who like beer can thank the Sumerians. That was far from all they invented. Take a look at this. This is a loom. This is what you weave cloth on. They figured out, well, we don't have to wear animal hides as clothes. We can take wool from our sheep and use it to weave cloth and use that cloth to make clothing. They invented musical instruments like the lute and the lyre. They invented the kiln in order to hard fire their pottery, which they also invented. In fact, you could credit the Sumerians for inventing Tupperware because they were mass producing pottery and using it for storage long before those little plastic containers came out. I bet you can guess what this is. I mean, it does say it right on the picture. It's an ancient pull toy. Not all inventions have to be grand, wheels and carts and kilns and pots. Some of them are much more humble, but in a young child's life, just as important, as this toy certainly was. The fingerprints of the ancient Sumerians are all across our modern lives. We see them every time we see a wheel. We see them every time we write, or see something written down, when we wear clothes made of cloth, when we play a musical instrument, when a farmer plows his field. We see them when someone drinks a cold beer or when a child pulls a toy. And yet there's still another invention that we need to talk about, namely bronze. Up until this point, we've been in the Stone Age. Tools and weapons have primarily been made out of stone, or wood, or mud brick. However, bronze changes all that. Before long, tools and weapons are being made out of bronze instead of out of stone or mud brick. So what is bronze? Well, it's a smelting together of tin and copper, and it forms a metal that is better for tools and weapons than either of those things. It is more durable, and it has a better edge. So, unsurprisingly, as soon as they figure out how to make bronze, Sumerians begin making their tools and weapons out of it. That transition from using stone as the main source of their tools and weapons to using bronze marks the transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age. Swords made out of bronze are much better than weapons made out of stone. Next week, however, we will be talking about a weapon mightier than either, because of course, the pen is mightier than the sword, and we are going to be diving into the development of writing. See you next week.